The bells of London pealed through the October air, their joyous clamour echoing across the Thames. In the royal chambers of Hampton Court Palace, King Henry VIII stood over the cradle of his newborn son, his broad frame trembling with a triumph 20 years in the making. Edward Tudor, healthy, squalling male, was England's salvation at last. The king's hands, still stained with ink from signing the proclamation of the prince's birth, hovered above the infant, as if to shield him from the very air. "God has answered my prayers," Henry murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The lines of his face, hardened by decades of disappointment and wrath, softened for the first time in memory. Outside, the celebrations had already begun. Bonfires lit up the night, their flames licking the sky in defiance of the autumn chill. Wine flowed freely in the streets, and merchants distributed bread to the poor, all paid for by the royal coffers. The kingdom, so long teetering on the edge of uncertainty, exhaled in collective relief. The Tudor line would endure. Yet beneath the jubilation the stakes were razor-sharp. Henry's obsession with securing a male heir had reshaped England itself. Wives discarded, the church shattered, alliances broken. 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had been declared bastards in his relentless pursuit. The spectre of civil war had loomed with each passing year, each stillborn son, each failed pregnancy. Now at 52, the king had his prince. Jane Seymour, pale but serene in her childbed, watched her husband with exhausted satisfaction. She had done what Catherine and Anne could not. "He is strong, your grace," she whispered, though the midwives had already noted the child's slight frame, the delicate wrists too fine for a future king. Henry barely heard her. His mind raced with plans. Edward's education, his betrothal, the securing of loyal advisers. The boy would need armor fitted by his 3rd birthday, swords by his 5th. He would be the perfect prince, the warrior king England deserved. A courtier cleared his throat. "The archbishop awaits to perform the christening, your grace." Henry nodded, but his gaze never left his son. "Let the world see him," he commanded. "Let them know England's future is secure." As the infant was carried to the chapel, wrapped in cloth of gold, the king allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. The ghosts of his failures, the sons lost before their first breath, the women who had borne them were silenced at last. But in the shadows, the physicians exchanged glances. The child's cries, though vigorous, were too quick, his breath uneven. They said nothing. Not today. Today belonged to the king's triumph. And so Edward VI entered the world, cradled in hope and swaddled in peril. The royal nursery at Hampton Court was a fortress of silk and vigilance. No draught was permitted to slip through the tapestries, no visitor entered without thorough inspection. Edward Tudor, England's precious prince, lay in a gilded cradle, his every breath monitored by a rotation of nurses whose hands were scrubbed raw with rosemary and vinegar. From the moment of his birth, whispers slithered through the court like winter mist. The child was small, too small for a king's son. His limbs were slender as reeds, his skin so translucent that the blue veins beneath pulsed like faint rivers. The midwives, seasoned in the births of noble infants, had hesitated before declaring him robust. "A delicate constitution," one murmured, and the phrase clung to Edward like a second christening. Henry VIII, when he visited, dismissed such concerns with a wave of his jeweled hand. "All babes are frail at first," he boomed, though his fingers tightened around the edge of the cradle as if to steady himself. "He will grow strong. He must." But the king's visits were brief, his patience thin. The nursery's oppressive stillness unnerved him, the hushed voices, the scent of medicinal herbs thick enough to choke. Better to leave the boy to the women and physicians, to the endless rituals of protection. Edward's days were a regimented dance of caution. His milk was tasted for poison before each feeding. His swaddling was changed hourly to ensure no dampness could settle in his lungs. Even the air he breathed was filtered through cloth soaked in rosewater, lest some foul miasma creep in. "Another blanket for His Highness," commanded Lady Bryan, the head nurse, her voice sharp with authority. "And ensure the fire does not smoke. The prince's chest must not be troubled." The servants scurried to obey, their faces pinched with exhaustion. None dared protest. Though the nursery sweltered like a midsummer noon, the prince's comfort was law. Yet for all their efforts, Edward remained a fragile thing. His coughs, though infrequent, sent the household into panicked silence. His fevers arrived without warning, painting his cheeks with an unnatural flush. The court physicians, men of renown and dubious remedies, prescribed tonics of crushed pearls and gold leaf, assuring the king they would fortify the royal humours. Jane Seymour, weak from childbirth, fretted from her chambers. "Is he feeding well?" she asked each time her ladies brought news. The answer was always the same: "Well enough, your grace." But the nurse's eyes betrayed the truth as they rocked the restless prince through the night. Edward slept fitfully, his tiny fists clenching, as if already bracing for the weight of a crown. Beyond the palace walls, England rejoiced. Bonfires still smouldered in the villages, prayers of thanksgiving echoed in the cathedrals. The kingdom believed in its golden prince, its promised future. Inside the nursery, the candles burned low, and the shadows stretched long. The physicians murmured of humours and balances, of signs and portents. And Edward, cradled in silk and fear, breathed. The court's devotion to Prince Edward was a spectacle of excess, a gilded cage built to disguise frailty. Every whim of the infant prince was anticipated before it could form into a cry. Servants hovered like moths around a flame, their movements precise, their voices hushed. Yet for all the opulence, the velvet-draped bassinet, the toys carved from ivory, the physician's presence loomed largest, their robes rustling with the weight of the king's command. "Another tincture, your grace," murmured Dr. Butts, his fingers stained yellow from endless herbs. He tipped a vial of murky liquid between Edward's lips, the prince's face contorting at the bitterness. The remedy, a concoction of ground stag's antler and white wine, was meant to invigorate the blood. Edward coughed, his small body trembling, but the doctor only nodded in satisfaction. "See how he resists? A sign of strength." Lady Bryan's lips thinned as she wiped the prince's chin with a linen cloth. She had nursed Henry's other children, had seen the way royal infants thrived under rough play and fresh air. But Edward was swaddled in stillness, his world reduced to the four walls of his nursery and the ceaseless ministrations of men who saw his body as a battleground of humours and stars. "Perhaps less physic and more sunlight," she ventured one morning, daring to meet the gaze of Dr. Wendier, the newest and most fervent of Edward's attendants. The man's laugh was brittle, and risked the prince taking chill. "The king would have our heads." He lifted Edward's wrist, pressing fingers to the thready pulse. "The planetary alignments are unfavourable this month. Mars dominates it, inflames the lungs. We must purge the excess heat." Thus followed the purges, draughts of rhubarb and hellebore that left Edward limp and whimpering. The leeches came next, applied to his pale skin to draw out the corrupted bile. The prince's cries were smothered in the folds of his nurse's skirts, lest the sound unsettle the courtiers loitering outside the door. Henry, when he visited, saw only what he wished. "His colour improves," he declared one evening, though Edward's cheeks were flushed from fever, not vigour. The king's hand, heavy with rings, cupped his son's head, a Tudor through and through. The physicians echoed the sentiment, their voices overlapping like a chant. "Indeed, your grace, a most robust constitution. The remedies are taking effect." Only Edward's half-sister Mary, slipping into the nursery during her rare visits, dared to press a cool hand to his brow. "He burns," she whispered to Lady Bryan. The nurse hesitated, then bent to adjust the prince's blankets. "All babes run warm, my lady." Mary's eyes, too old for her 17 years, flickered with doubt, but she said nothing more. To question the prince's care was to question the king's will. And so the charade continued. The court chroniclers penned glowing accounts of Edward's progress. The ambassadors spread word of England's thriving heir. The gold-embroidered gowns he wore to his monthly public appearances hid the thinness of his limbs. Behind closed doors, the physicians debated in Latin, their voices low and urgent. They bled him when the moon waned, fed him roasted peacock when it waxed. Each failure was met with a new theory, a more elaborate cure. Edward, caught in the storm of their desperation, grew quieter. His laughter, once a bright spark in the stifling nursery, faded to silence. He watched the world with solemn eyes, as if already understanding the cruel irony of his existence. The more they sought to strengthen him, the weaker he became. The kingdom, oblivious, rejoiced in its prince. The physicians recorded each cough, each feverish night in ledgers that would never reach the king's desk. And the nursery, for all its splendor, smelled increasingly of blood and bitter herbs. By the time Edward turned 6, the nursery had been replaced by the schoolroom, a place of ink-stained fingers and ceaseless scrutiny. The prince's education was a matter of state, overseen by a rotating cadre of tutors hand-picked by Henry himself. Each morning before the palace had fully stirred, Edward was roused from bed, his small frame swallowed by the stiff brocade of his doublet. "Again, your highness," intoned Dr. Richard Cox, rapping his knuckles against the oak table. The tutor's beard bristled with impatience as he pointed to the Latin conjugation scrawled across the parchment. Amo, amas, amat. Edward's fingers trembled as he traced the words. The candlelight flickered, casting wavering shadows over the page. Amo, amas, amat, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Louder, my prince? A king's voice must carry. Edward swallowed, his throat dry. He had already recited the verbs a dozen times, but Dr. Cox's standards were as unyielding as his father's. He drew a breath and tried again. Amo, amas, amat. A cough interrupted him, sharp and sudden. He pressed a hand to his chest, his face flushing with effort. Dr. Cox sighed, his quill scratching a note in the margins of his ledger. We shall pause for physic. A servant materialized with a goblet of honeyed wine, laced with powdered pearl, another of the physician's concoctions to fortify the lungs. Edward drank obediently, though the sweetness clung to his tongue like syrup. He hated the taste, hated the way it made his stomach twist, but protest was never an option. By mid-morning, the schoolroom swelled with more tutors. Mr. Cheek arrived to drill him on Greek, his voice lilting as he recited passages from Herodotus. Edward's translations were swift and precise, too precise, some whispered. His mind was a keen blade, but his body lagged behind. When the other boys of his age practiced archery in the courtyards, Edward was confined to his books, his limbs deemed too delicate for sport. Your Highness excels in theology, remarked Archbishop Cranmer during one of his weekly visits. He beamed as Edward passed a complex passage from Erasmus, his small hands deftly turning the pages of the heavy Bible, a most pious prince. Edward nodded, but his gaze strayed to the window, where the distant shouts of the stable boys drifted up from the yard. The sunlight painted the lawns gold, and for a moment he imagined himself running through the grass, unfettered by tutors or tonics. The fantasy shattered as Dr. Wendy swept into the room, his satchel of remedies clinking ominously. Time for your Highness's midday regimen. The prince's shoulders slumped, but he did not resist. The leeches came first, applied to the inside of his arms to balance the humours, then the foul-smelling poultices, strapped to his chest with linen bandages. Edward bore it all in silence, his jaw clenched tight against the sting. Such fortitude, murmured Lady Bryan, her fingers brushing his damp forehead. Edward said nothing. Complaints were for ordinary boys, not future kings. By evening, when the last of his tutors had departed, the prince was permitted a brief respite. He would sit by the fire, his thin legs dangling from the too large chair, and sketch maps of imaginary battles in the margins of his notes. Sometimes, if the coughing did not interrupt, he would hum a tune his mother had sung to him, a memory so faint it might have been a dream. But even these small rebellions were fleeting. The physicians would return, their faces grave, their hands full of new remedies. The tutors would arrive at dawn with fresh scrolls and expectations, and Henry, when he visited, would clap his son on the back with pride. See how he thrives, the king boasted to the Spanish ambassador one evening, oblivious to the dark circles beneath Edward's eyes. A scholar and a statesman in the making. The ambassador bowed, his gaze lingering a moment too long on the prince's pallor. Indeed, your majesty, a most remarkable child. Edward, standing stiffly at his father's side, forced a smile. That night, as the palace slept, he curled beneath his blankets, his body aching from the day's trials. The candle by his bedside guttered, its flame drowning in wax. In the darkness, he allowed himself one small, shuddering breath, unmeasured, unjudged. Then he closed his eyes, and the weight of the crown pressed down once more. The fever came without warning. One moment, Edward was reciting psalms under the watchful eye of Archbishop Cranmer, his voice steady despite the dull ache behind his temples. The next, the words blurred on the page, the letters swimming like black insects. A wave of heat crashed over him, so intense he gasped. Your Highness. Cranmer's hand shot out to steady him as the prince swayed in his chair. Edward blinked, his vision tunneling. The room, so familiar with its oak-panelled walls and leaded windows, seemed to tilt sideways. I am well, he lied, but the words came out slurred, his tongue thick in his mouth. Then the coughing started. It tore through him like a living thing, racking his slight frame with such violence that his ribs screamed in protest. Each hack was wet and ragged, scraping his throat raw. When he finally managed to draw breath, the taste of copper flooded his mouth. The archbishop's face drained of colour. He snatched a handkerchief from his sleeve and pressed it to Edward's lips. When he pulled it away, the linen was speckled with red. The room erupted into motion. Cranmer bellowed for physicians. Servants scattered like startled birds. Somewhere beyond the chaos, Edward heard the frantic clanging of the alarm bell, a sound reserved for royal emergencies. Yet even as hands lifted him from the chair, as the first cold compress was pressed to his brow, Edward's thoughts snagged on one terrible certainty: this is different. The fevers before had been brief, inconvenient flickers extinguished by tonics and bed rest. This clung to his bones like tar. The cough was no longer the dry, tickling thing that came with winter draughts. It was deep, hungry. By the time the royal physicians arrived, their robes flapping like the wings of carrion birds, the prince was shivering beneath a mountain of blankets, his skin slick with sweat. Dr. Butts elbowed his way to the bedside, his nostrils flaring at the sickly sweet stench of infection. "How long has His Highness been thus?" "Less than an hour," Cranmer said, his voice tight. But Edward, drifting in and out of coherence, knew the truth. The fatigue had been building for weeks. The headaches, the way his breath hitched when he climbed the palace stairs. He'd said nothing, of course. A Tudor did not admit weakness. The physicians descended like a flock of crows, their diagnoses overlapping. An imbalance of the humours. Malignant vapours from the Thames. Mars in retrograde exacerbating the pulmonary. Leeches were summoned. A poultice of crushed garlic and mustard seed was slapped onto Edward's chest, burning through his nightshirt. Someone bled him, the lancet's bite sharp amidst the fever's haze. The bowl filled too quickly. Through it all, one phrase slithered between the courtiers clustered at the door. Like his uncle, Prince Arthur, Henry's elder brother, had coughed himself to death at 15. The whispers reached the king within the hour. Henry arrived like a storm, his bulk filling the chamber as the physicians scrambled to bow. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice boomed, but Edward, dazed with fever, saw the flicker of fear in his father's eyes. Dr. Wendy stepped forward, oozing reassurance. "A passing ague, Your Majesty. The prince is strong." "Strong?" Henry seized the physician's arm, his fingers digging into the man's sleeve. "You told me the last fever was nothing, and the one before that." His gaze flicked to Edward, who lay limp against the pillows, his breathing a shallow rasp. Something in the king's face fractured. For one terrifying moment, Edward thought his father might weep. Then Henry straightened, his jaw hardening. "Double the guards on his door. No one enters without my leave." He turned to the window, where the first stars of evening pricked the sky. "And send word to the Archbishop. We will have prayers said in every church in England." The unspoken command hung heavier than the medicinal stench. No one speaks of this. As the king strode out, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats, the physicians exchanged glances. Their silence was answer enough. Edward closed his eyes. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom slept, blissfully unaware. The cough rattled in his chest, a second heartbeat. "This is different." The physicians whispered the word like a curse. Consumption. Edward's chamber had become a prison of incense and dread. The heavy drapes were drawn against the daylight, as if the sun itself might worsen his condition. The air reeked of vinegar and burning herbs, useless defences against the sickness gnawing at his lungs. Dr. Butts pressed his ear to the prince's back, listening to the wet, uneven rasps beneath the skin. When he straightened, his face was grim. "The right lung is afflicted," he murmured to his colleagues. "The corruption spreads." Edward, propped against a mountain of pillows, watched them with glassy eyes. He had heard enough of their hushed conferences to know what it meant. Consumption did not loosen its grip. It hollowed a man out, sip by sip, until only a brittle shell remained. "The king must be told," said Dr. Wendy, though his voice lacked conviction. "And say what?" snapped Dr. Owen, the youngest and least favoured of the royal physicians. "That his heir is rotting from the inside?" A silence fell, thick with the weight of treason. They settled on euphemisms: a delicate constitution, a seasonal aggravation, a humoral imbalance requiring vigorous intervention. The treatments grew more desperate, more brutal. Edward endured them all without protest. Leeches clung to his ribs, their black bodies swelling with his blood. Blistering plasters seared his skin, raising angry welts meant to draw out the pestilence. The worst were the purges, vile draughts of mercury and crushed emeralds that left him writhing in agony, his guts twisting as if full of knives. "It will pass, Your Highness," murmured Lady Bryan, wiping the sweat from his brow after one such ordeal. Her hands trembled. Edward said nothing. The taste of bile still coated his tongue. Beyond his sick room, the court maintained its charade. Ambassadors were assured of the prince's robust health. Official portraits showed a rosy-cheeked boy, not the gaunt spectre haunting the royal apartments. When Edward was forced to make appearances, the tailors worked miracles, padding his doublets, painting colour onto his pallid cheeks with crushed berry stain. "Stand straight," Henry growled before one such audience with the French envoy. The king's fingers dug into Edward's shoulder, steadying him. "Smile." Edward obeyed. His lips cracked as they stretched. The envoy, of course, noticed nothing amiss or was wise enough to pretend otherwise. "What a vigorous young prince," he declared, bowing low. "England is blessed indeed." Henry's laughter boomed through the hall, a Tudor through and through. That night, Edward coughed until the handkerchief was soaked scarlet. The physicians doubled the mercury. By spring, even the strongest remedies failed. Edward's body rebelled, his hair thinned, his nails turned brittle as old parchment. The stench of decay clung to him despite the servants' frantic scrubbing with rosewater and mint. "Perhaps a change of air," suggested Dr. Butts weakly. Henry, his patience fraying, slammed a fist onto the council table. "I did not appoint you to offer perhaps." The physicians flinched. They knew the fate of those who failed the king, and so the treatments continued. The prince's arms became a patchwork of leech scars and needle pricks. His once keen mind dulled under the constant assault of pain and potions. Only at night, in the blessed solitude of his bedchamber, did Edward allow himself the truth. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the uneven flutter beneath his ribs. "I am dying." Outside his window, the first fireflies of summer danced over the palace gardens. Their tiny lights flickered, bright, brief, gone. Edward watched them until his eyes burned. Then he turned his face into the pillow and coughed until the linen turned red. The ulcers appeared overnight, angry, weeping sores that bloomed across Edward's arms and chest like some grotesque garden. By morning, the stench of decay had seeped into the very walls of his chamber, a cloying sweetness beneath the vinegar and herbs. Lady Bryan gasped when she drew back the blankets. "Sweet Jesu," she whispered, crossing herself. Edward barely stirred. His skin had taken on a sallow hue, stretched taut over bones that seemed to sharpen by the hour. The fever had not broken in weeks, and now his breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, each one laced with the metallic tang of blood. Dr. Butts arrived first, his usual confidence faltering at the sight. He prodded one of the ulcers with a silver probe, and Edward whimpered, his eyelids fluttering. A thick yellowish fluid oozed from the wound. "This is no ordinary humoral imbalance," the physician muttered, wiping his instrument on a cloth already stained with similar secretions. "Then what is it?" Lady Bryan demanded, her voice trembling. Dr. Butts hesitated. The truth that the prince's body was consuming itself was treasonous to speak aloud. Instead, he reached for his satchel. "We must draw out the corruption. Leeches, perhaps, or a poultice of egg white and sulphur." Edward turned his face away, too weak to protest. He had endured this ritual 100 times before. The leeches would fasten to his flesh, the poultices would sear his skin, and nothing would change. The rot was inside him, deep and spreading. By midday, the entire Privy Council had been alerted. They gathered in hushed clusters outside the sick room, their faces drawn with the unspoken question, what happens if he dies? Henry arrived like a thunderclap, his presence scattering the whispers. He strode to the bedside, his nostrils flaring at the stench, but his gaze never left his son. "Edward," he commanded, as if sheer will could rouse him. The prince's eyelids lifted, just barely. His lips moved, but no sound came out. A thin trickle of blood escaped the corner of his mouth. The king's jaw tightened. He rounded on the physicians. "Why does he worsen?" Dr. Wendy stepped forward, his robes reeking of myrrh. "The humours are deeply unsettled, Your Majesty. Mars and Saturn align." "Enough!" Henry's roar sent a servant stumbling back. "I want remedies, not astrological prattle." The physicians exchanged glances. Then, with the air of men out of options, they proposed the unthinkable. A tonic of crushed pearls and mercury, strong enough to purge even the most stubborn corruption. Henry gave a curt nod. "Do it." Edward barely registered the hands lifting him, the cold rim of the cup against his lips. The draught burned like fire, searing his throat, his stomach, his very veins. He convulsed, a ragged cry tearing from his chest, but the physicians held him fast. "It must work its course," Dr. Butt said, though his voice lacked conviction. The pain was unbearable. Edward's vision blurred, his limbs thrashing against the sheets. Somewhere beyond the agony he heard Lady Bryan weeping, and then, blessedly, the darkness took him. When he awoke, the chamber was silent, but for the crackle of the hearth. The ulcers still festered, the stench still clung, but the king was gone. Edward closed his eyes. The truth settled over him, cold and certain. No tonic could save him now. The physician's desperation curdled into cruelty. Each morning, Edward was bled. Not the careful punctures of before, but deep, jagged cuts that left his arms striped with crimson. The bowl at his bedside filled too quickly, its contents dark as wine. The leeches, grown fat and sluggish from their feasts, were replaced with fresh ones, their tiny mouths latching onto unbroken skin. "The humours must be balanced," Dr. Wendy intoned, as if reciting scripture. His fingers, slick with Edward's blood, adjusted the tourniquet above the prince's elbow. "The black bile dominates." Edward did not cry out. His voice had long since abandoned him, worn away by coughing and silence. He watched the ceiling instead, counting the cracks in the plaster as the lancet bit into his flesh. 1, 2, 3. The pain was a distant thing now, muffled beneath layers of fever and exhaustion. The purges were worse. They forced draughts of white hellebore down his throat, a poison meant to scour his insides clean. Within minutes, Edward's body convulsed, expelling everything, food, bile, blood, until he was retching air. The physicians nodded in approval, mistaking his suffering for progress. "See how the corruption leaves him," Dr. Butt said, pressing a hand to Edward's heaving back. Lady Bryan turned away, her face ashen. She had nursed 3 generations of Tudors, had seen infants thrive and wither in her care, but this was butchery disguised as medicine. At night, when the physicians retreated to their chambers to debate new theories, she dared to press a damp cloth to Edward's brow. His skin burned like embers. "They are killing you," she whispered, so softly the words barely stirred the air. Edward's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes, though wide and glassy with pain, spoke volumes. "I know." The court, of course, saw none of this. Official bulletins spoke of a mild indisposition, of a prince convalescing with expected vigor. The king's counsellors repeated the lie with polished smiles, their gazes sliding away from the truth like water off oilcloth. Only once did the facade crack. The Spanish ambassador, a shrewd man with a network of spies, managed to bribe a laundress for the prince's bedsheets. The linen, stiff with blood and pus, told its own story. "He will not last the summer," the ambassador wrote in his coded dispatch. The letter never reached Spain. Henry's spies intercepted it, and the laundress vanished into the tower's depths. But the whispers spread anyway, slithering through the palace like poison. "The prince is rotting alive. The Tudor line ends with him." Henry's response was swift and brutal. 3 courtiers were hanged for treasonous gossip. The physicians were commanded to redouble their efforts. And Edward? Edward endured. He swallowed the mercury-laced broths that made his teeth loosen. He lay still as the blistering plasters ate into his flesh. He coughed blood into silk handkerchiefs that were swiftly burned. Through it all, he played his part, the dutiful prince, the uncomplaining heir. Even as his body betrayed him, even as the rot gnawed deeper, he gave them no satisfaction of his suffering. Only in the darkest hours, when the chamber was empty but for the flickering candlelight, did he allow himself to tremble. He would press a hand to his ribs, feeling the uneven flutter beneath, and wonder which breath would be his last. Beyond his window, the world carried on. The sun rose and set, the gardens bloomed. The kingdom, oblivious, awaited its golden future. And Edward, wrapped in the stench of his own decay, counted the cracks in the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. The summons came at dawn. Edward's attendants descended upon his chamber like a flock of crows. Their hands fluttering with false cheer, they dressed him in layers of padded velvet, a child's armor against prying eyes, and painted his hollow cheeks with crushed madder root until the color bloomed unnaturally bright. "The king commands your presence in the great hall," murmured the groom of the stool, avoiding Edward's sunken gaze as he fastened the jeweled collar around his throat. The prince said nothing. His strength, what little remained, was reserved for the monumental task of staying upright. The fever had ebbed for the first time in weeks, leaving him hollowed out and shivering, his body a patchwork of sores and scars. But the king's word was law. They lifted him from the bed, his legs buckling instantly. A page caught him under the arms, his grip tightening as Edward swayed. "Steady, Your Highness," the boy whispered, his voice cracking with fear. The walk to the great hall was an agony of measured steps. Every breath rattled in Edward's chest, each one threatening to dissolve into a cough. The corridors, usually bustling with courtiers, had been cleared, no witnesses to the prince's frailty. Only the tapestries watched as he passed, their woven kings and saints staring down in silent judgment. At the doors, Henry waited. The king was resplendent in cloth of gold, his bulk blocking the light from the hall beyond. For a moment his gaze flickered over his son, the too thin wrists, the trembling jaw, and something like grief twisted his features. Then it was gone, buried beneath the familiar mask of command. "Straighten your shoulders," Henry ordered, gripping Edward's arm. The French delegation must see England's strength. Edward nodded, swallowing the metallic taste in his mouth. He knew the script. Smile, nod, do not cough. The doors swung open. A wave of heat and noise struck them, the reek of perfumed nobles, the glitter of 100 candles. The hall was packed with courtiers and ambassadors, all craning for a glimpse of the prince whose absence had spawned whispers across Europe. Edward stepped forward, his legs trembling beneath him. For a moment, the illusion held. The padding in his doublet disguised his emaciated frame. The rouge masked his pallor. The jewels at his throat caught the light, drawing every eye away from the shadows beneath his own. Then the coughing started. It began as a tickle, a mere tightening in his chest. Edward clenched his jaw, willing it away, but the itch grew, spreading like fire, until his body convulsed with the force of it. The sound was wet and ragged, tearing through the hall's murmured admiration. A horrified silence fell. Blood sprayed across Edward's palm, bright as rubies against his ghostly skin. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The French ambassador recoiled, his goblet slipping from his fingers to clatter against the floor. Henry moved swiftly, his bulk shielding Edward from view. "My son is overcome with joy at your visit," he boomed, forcing laughter into his voice. He clamped a hand on Edward's shoulder, fingers digging in like talons. A Tudor's passion is not easily contained. The courtiers rallied, their applause a beat too late, too loud, but their eyes betrayed them, darting to the crimson stains on Edward's sleeve, the way his breath hitched between each forced smile. The ambassador bowed, his face carefully neutral. "Indeed, Your Majesty, a most vigorous prince." Edward stood frozen, his vision swimming. The hall seemed to tilt around him, the faces blurring into a single grotesque mask of pity and calculation. They all saw it now, the truth they had been forbidden to name. England's golden heir was dying. Henry's grip tightened, hauling him upright. "To your chambers," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Now." As the servants rushed forward to escort him away, Edward caught a final glimpse of the court. The whispers already beginning behind raised hands, the swift exits of those eager to spread the news. Behind him the king's laughter rang out again, too hearty, too hollow. And Edward, shuffling back to his prison of silken shadows, understood at last. He was not a son anymore. He was a spectacle. The collapse came without ceremony. One moment, Edward was standing in the courtyard, squinting against the pale winter sun as his attendants debated whether he was strong enough for a brief walk. The next, his legs buckled, and the world tipped sideways. He did not feel the impact of the cobblestones, only the hands, dozens of them, lifting him, their grips urgent and bruising, voices overlapped in a cacophony of panic. "Fetch the king! Call the physicians! God save the prince!" Edward floated in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of the chaos. The rough jostle of the litter carrying him back to his chambers, the stench of fear sweat beneath the servants' perfumes, the distant tolling of a bell, whether in celebration or mourning, he could not tell. When he woke fully, it was to the familiar ceiling of his bedchamber, its cracks mapped like rivers across plaster. Only now the room had changed. The windows were shuttered tight, sealing out even the weakest sliver of light. The air hung thick with the cloying sweetness of decay, barely masked by incense, and the bed, once a symbol of royal luxury, had become an island of suffering, its sheets stained with blood and sweat. "Water," Edward croaked, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. A cup was pressed to his lips, but the liquid inside was not water, The bitter tang of medicine made him gag, but the physician's hand was firm. "Drink, your highness. It will strengthen you." Edward obeyed, though he knew the lie for what it was. Nothing strengthened him any more. Each dose only carved him out further, leaving him hollow and trembling. As the draught took effect, the room swam into sharper focus. The physicians huddled near the fireplace, their whispers carrying despite their efforts. The lungs are all but consumed. The ulcers spread inward. Lady Bryan sat by the bedside, her embroidery abandoned in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual composure frayed. When she noticed Edward watching her, she forced a smile. "The king has ordered prayers, said in every parish," she said, her voice too bright. "The entire realm is interceding for your recovery." Edward turned his face away. He had heard such platitudes before. Prayers had not stopped the sores from blooming on his skin. They would not unrot his lungs. A new presence entered the room, Dr. Wendy, bearing a silver tray laden with fresh leeches. Their black bodies glistened in the firelight, already stirring with hunger. Edward closed his eyes. The procedure was swift and methodical. Cold fingers rolled up his sleeves, exposing the mottled skin of his arms. The leeches were applied with precision, their tiny mouths latching onto the least damaged patches they could find. Edward did not flinch. After months of this, the sensation was almost familiar, the initial pinch, the sluggish crawl as they fed. "Excellent," Dr. Wendy murmured. Noting the leech's rapid swelling in his ledger, the corrupted blood drains. Edward said nothing. He watched instead as one of the creatures detached early, its engorged body falling to the sheets with a wet plop. It writhed weakly, then stilled. "Even they cannot stomach me," he thought, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his chest. It came out as a cough, speckling the pillow with red. The physicians exchanged glances. That night, the fever returned with a vengeance. Edward thrashed beneath the blankets, his skin burning one moment, icy the next. Visions flickered at the edges of his consciousness, his mother's face, pale in death, his father's towering rage, the throne its gilt edges blurred as if seen through water. "Make it stop," he begged, though he no longer knew who he was addressing. God? The physicians? The disease itself? No one answered. The servants changed the sheets twice before dawn, each time stripping away linen stiff with sweat and blood. Edward drifted in the intervals, his mind untethered from time. Once he thought he heard Mary's voice outside the door, demanding entry. The guards refused her. By morning, the truth was undeniable. The prince's arms, once merely thin, were now skeletal, the bones pressing against the skin like sticks wrapped in parchment. The sores had spread to his neck, their yellow edges stark against his pallor, and the stench, not even the strongest incense could mask it now. The physicians' reports to the king grew vague, their language veiled in euphemism, but their eyes, when they thought no one was looking, held the same grim certainty. Edward saw it all, understood it all. As another coughing fit racked his body, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished surface of a water basin, a sunken-eyed stranger, more ghost than boy, the face of a king who would never reign. The pain had long since passed the point of language. It lived in Edward now, a second pulse, a shadow self that gnawed at his bones and filled his lungs with liquid fire. The physician's ministrations blurred into a ceaseless cycle of torment, the scalding poultices, the needles piercing his flesh, the leeches gorging until they burst. He no longer screamed. His voice had abandoned him, leaving only whimpers that dissolved into the stifling air of his chamber. The sores had won. They marched across his body, festering and weeping, tunneling deeper as if searching for the last unspoiled parts of him. The stench of rot clung to everything, the bedclothes, the rushes on the floor, the hands of the servants who turned him like a piece of meat on a spit. Lady Bryan no longer pretended. She wept openly as she dabbed at the ulcers with vinegar-soaked linen, her tears mixing with the pus on the cloth. "My prince," she whispered, as if the words alone could mend him. Edward stared past her, his gaze fixed on the canopy above. The embroidered Tudor roses there, once vibrant, now seemed to wilt in the candlelight. He thought of the gardens outside, of the way the real roses had smelled last summer, sweet and alive, nothing like the reek of his own decay. A commotion at the door shattered the fragile silence. "Out of my way," Henry's voice, thunderous even through the fever haze. The guards scrambled aside, and the king filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light from the corridor. For a moment, Father and son simply looked at one another. Henry's face, usually so florid with rage or wine, was ashen. His eyes darted over Edward's ruined body, the shock in them raw and undisguised. Then the mask slammed back into place. "This is no fit state for a prince," Henry growled, rounding on the physicians. "Where are your remedies, your cures?" Dr. Butt stepped forward, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Your Majesty, we have exhausted every—" Exhausted? The king seized the physician's collar, hauling him up until their faces were inches apart. "That boy is the future of England. You will not rest until he is well." Edward watched the scene unfold, as if from a great distance. He wanted to laugh or weep. Even now, with death crouching in the corners of the room, his father could not speak the truth aloud. Henry released Dr. Butts with a shove and turned back to the bed. His hand hovered over Edward's brow, as if afraid to touch what might crumble at the slightest pressure. "You will rally," he said, the command fraying at the edges. "Tudors do not yield." Edward's lips parted. A bubble of blood formed and burst. The king recoiled as if scalded. Silence stretched between them, thick with all the words they could not say. Then Henry straightened, his rings glinting as he gestured to the servants. "Burn more incense, and fetch the archbishop. My son will receive the last rites." The words sent a ripple through the room. Last rites were for the dying. Henry caught the reaction and bared his teeth. "A precaution," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. As the servants scurried to obey, the king leaned down, his breath hot and wine sour against Edward's ear. "Do not shame me," he whispered. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a retreating storm. Edward closed his eyes. The pain was everywhere now, a living thing chewing through his flesh. But beneath it, beneath the fear and the loneliness, a strange peace settled over him. The pretense was over. Somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, birds sang in the palace gardens. The sound was faint, almost imaginary. Edward clung to it, letting it carry him away from the stench, from the whispers, from the weight of the crown he would never wear. The candles guttered, shadows danced across the walls, and Edward, at last, stopped fighting. The palace held its breath. Edward's chamber had become a sepulchre, thick with the scent of beeswax and decay. The physicians no longer pretended to treat him, only hovered at the edges, their hands clasped like mourners at a vigil. The king's last command had been clear: keep him alive until the succession is secured. But even Henry's will could not halt the inevitable. Lady Bryan kept watch by the bed, her embroidery abandoned in her lap. The needlework, a half-finished Tudor rose, lay forgotten, its threads as frayed as her nerves. She dabbed Edward's forehead with a damp cloth, though the fever had long since burned away to an unnatural chill. His skin was parchment thin, stretched over bones that seemed to sharpen by the hour. "The archbishop is here," murmured a servant from the doorway. Cranmer entered, his vestments whispering against the rushes. The scent of holy oil mingled with the sick-room stench as he approached the bed. Edward's eyes fluttered open, two dull shards of blue in a face already ghostly. "Your Highness," Cranmer said softly, bending close, "I have come to pray with you." Edward's lips moved, but no sound emerged. A thin trail of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. Lady Bryan wiped it away with a trembling hand. The archbishop began the rites, his voice steady despite the grief tightening his throat. The Latin phrases, "per fistam sanctam unctionem," wrapped around the room like a shroud. Edward's fingers twitched in response as if grasping for the words. Beyond the chamber, the court seethed with silent frenzy. Messengers slipped in and out of shadowed corridors, their dispatches coded and urgent. The Duke of Northumberland convened secret meetings in the council chambers, his voice low and insistent. The Lady Jane must be prepared. Mary, barred from her brother's sick room by the king's decree, knelt in her private chapel, her rosary beads clicking like a death-watch beetle. She prayed for Edward's soul and for her own vindication. If he dies, the throne is mine by right. Elizabeth, ever cautious, kept to her studies, her face a mask of calm, but her quill hovered over the page, leaving ink to pool like blood on the parchment. She had learned early survival meant silence. Back in the sick room, Cranmer anointed Edward's forehead with oil, tracing the sign of the cross. The prince's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that filled the silence between prayers. Lady Bryan stifled a sob. "It won't be long now," whispered Dr. Butts to his colleagues. They nodded, their faces grim. The truth was a living thing in the room, pulsing beneath every murmured prayer, every stifled gasp. Edward's gaze drifted to the window, where a sliver of twilight bled through the shutters. Somewhere beyond, the first stars pricked the sky. His lips moved again, shaping a word, or perhaps just a breath. Free. The candles flickered, the shadows deepened, and the court, poised on the knife's edge between chaos and order, waited. The convulsions began at midnight. Edward's body arched off the bed, his spine bowing like a drawn longbow. His fingers clawed at the sheets, twisting the fine linen into knots as his limbs thrashed against some unseen tormentor. A guttural sound tore from his throat, half scream, half choke, as his lungs fought for air they could no longer hold. Lady Bryan recoiled, her hands pressed to her mouth. "Sweet Jesu, help him!" The physicians surged forward, their remedies useless but their motions frantic. Dr. Wendy forced a wooden spoon between Edward's teeth to keep him from biting through his tongue. Dr. Butts poured another draught of poppy syrup down his throat, though it spilled more than it soothed. The prince's body rejected everything now, writhing beyond the reach of their tonics and prayers. Edward's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Foam gathered at the corners of his lips, pink with blood. His breath came in short, wet gasps, each one a battle lost. The disease had won. It filled his chest, drowning him from within. The archbishop's prayers grew louder, desperate to be heard over the death rattle. "Libera me, Domine, de morte aeterna." But there would be no liberation, only suffering. Edward's heels drummed against the mattress, his body convulsing so violently the bed frame shook. The ulcers had burst now, weeping pus that stained the sheets yellow. The stench was unbearable, a reek of rotting meat and spoiled medicine that made even the hardened physicians gag. Somewhere beyond the horror, a clock chimed. 1 toll, 2. On the third chime, Edward went still. For one terrible moment, the room held its breath. The prince's chest rose, once, twice, then sank for the final time. His mouth slackened, his fingers uncurled. And just like that, England's golden prince was gone. The silence that followed was thicker than the stench. The physicians exchanged glances, their hands hovering uselessly over the corpse. Lady Bryan collapsed into a chair, her sobs muffled in her apron. Cranmer made the sign of the cross. "In paradisum dedicant, te angeli," but there was no paradise in this room, only the brutal truth of flesh undone. Edward's body, once groomed for kingship, lay ravaged and twisted, his face frozen in a rictus of pain. No bard would sing of this death. No portrait would capture this moment. History would remember a boy king called to God, not the animal agony of his passing. The door burst open. Henry stood on the threshold, his face ashen. He took in the scene, the blood, the stench, the still form on the bed, and something in him shattered. No, the word was a plea, a denial, a command. No one answered. The king staggered forward, his bulk suddenly unsteady. He reached for his son, then recoiled at the feel of cooling flesh. His hands, which had wielded swords and signed death warrants, trembled over Edward's ruined face. "You were supposed to be strong," he whispered. But the boy who had spent his life straining to meet that demand could not hear him. Somewhere in the palace, a servant began to wail. The sound slithered through the corridors, gathering strength as it went. Soon it would reach the streets, then the kingdom, then the world. But in that first raw moment, there was only the corpse on the bed, the stink of failure, and the deafening silence where a dynasty's future had been. Henry turned away. Behind him, the physicians began the work of preparing the body, washing away the blood, the sweat, the evidence of suffering. They would anoint him with spices, dress him in cloth of gold, and present him to the court as if he had merely fallen asleep. The lie was already taking shape, and Edward, freed at last from the weight of crowns and expectations, lay beyond caring. The bells tolled across London, their mournful peals echoing through streets draped in black. The kingdom wept, or pretended to. In the grand cathedrals, priests extolled Edward's piety and promise. In the taverns, men drank to the prince's memory, their voices hushed with the gravity of loss. But behind closed doors, in the hushed corners of the court and the shadowed alleys of the city, another sound whispered beneath the grief: relief. The official proclamation had been careful in its wording: a sudden illness, a peaceful passing, a prince called too soon to God's embrace. No mention of the months of agony, the stench of decay, the boy who had rotted alive in the royal bedchamber. History would remember Edward as the golden heir, not the wasted figure convulsing in his own filth. Lady Bryan folded the prince's last handkerchief stiff with dried blood into a cedar chest, her movements precise. The servants had already burned the fouled bedsheets, scrubbed the floors with lye, and aired the chamber until no trace of sickness remained. Even the physicians' ledgers had been edited, their grim observations replaced with vague references to a tragic weakness of constitution. "It was God's will," murmured the Duke of Northumberland to the council, though his eyes gleamed with calculation. The succession was a chessboard, and he had already begun moving his pieces. Mary shut herself in her chapel, her prayers laced with righteous fury. They denied me his last moments, she thought, her fingers tightening around her rosary. But they cannot deny my birthright. Elizabeth, ever watchful, kept her face a mask of sorrow, yet her mind raced, weighing risks, measuring loyalties. A kingdom without Edward was a kingdom on the edge of a knife. Only Henry remained untouched by the undercurrents of ambition. The king had locked himself in his privy chamber, surrounded by portraits of his son, all painted in health, all lies. He drank until the images blurred, until he could almost believe the boy in the next room was merely sleeping. But the truth lingered, thick as the incense they burned to mask it. In the streets, the people mourned as they were told to mourn. They draped their doorways in black cloth, murmured prayers for the prince's soul, and whispered of omens, the comet seen the week before his death, the fox that had run through Westminster Abbey at midnight. Yet beneath the perfunctory grief, fear spread like ink in water. With Edward gone, the Tudor line hung by a thread. The spectre of civil war loomed, its breath already chilling the back of England's neck. And in the silent spaces between the bells, between the sobs and the sermons, the truth festered. A boy had died in torment. A kingdom teetered on the brink. And the silence after was the most deafening sound of all. The throne room stood empty, its gilded chair a hollow monument to what might have been. Edward's death had left a wound that would not heal. The kingdom, so carefully stitched together by Henry's iron will, began to fray at the edges. The councillors who had once bowed to the boy king now eyed one another with wary calculation, their loyalty shifting like sand. Mary was the first to make her claim. "By right of blood and law, the crown is mine," she declared, her voice ringing through the council chamber. The Spanish ambassador stood at her shoulder, a silent promise of imperial backing. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with fervour. This was her moment, her divine right. Northumberland's smile was thin as parchment. "Your Grace misunderstands the late king's will." He unrolled the document with a flourish, its seal still gleaming. "The Lady Jane Grey is named heir." Gasps rippled through the room. Jane, a Protestant cousin of royal blood, pale and trembling in her borrowed finery, looked as though she might faint. Elizabeth, standing apart, said nothing. Her gaze flicked between the players, Mary's righteous fury, Northumberland's cold ambition, Jane's silent terror, and saw the future unfolding like a tragedy. The people chose quickly. London streets erupted at the news of Jane's proclamation. "Long live Queen Mary," they roared, their Catholic fervour boiling over after years of suppression. The Lady Jane's reign lasted 9 days, a fleeting shadow on the throne before the tide of rebellion swept her to the Tower. Mary entered the city in triumph, her banners flying high, but the cheers masked a deeper unease. The kingdom was fractured, its religious wounds reopened. The burnings began within the year. Heretics, reformers, anyone who dared deny the old faith. The smoke of martyrdom curled over Smithfield, and the people whispered that Bloody Mary had earned her name. Elizabeth, ever the survivor, bent like a reed in the storm. She attended Mass, wore her rosary with feigned piety, and kept her true thoughts locked behind a smile. But the Tower's shadow loomed large in her dreams. "You are your mother's daughter," Mary spat during one fraught audience, her eyes blazing with suspicion. Elizabeth curtsied low, her voice honeyed. "I am England's daughter, sister, nothing more." The lie kept her alive. By the time Mary's own illness took root, a cancer, some said, or a heart withered by grief, the kingdom was exhausted. The Spanish marriage had brought no heir, only the spectre of foreign domination. The fields lay fallow, the treasury drained by war and waste. Elizabeth, when her time came, inherited a broken realm. She stood before her first parliament, her red hair bright beneath the crown, and spoke of unity. But the ghosts lingered. Edward's wasted promise, Mary's bloody zeal, the endless what-ifs that haunted the Tudor line. "We are bound together," she declared, by God's will and England's need. Yet even as the court cheered, the old councillors exchanged glances. They remembered the Golden Prince who had coughed his life away, the dynasty that had hinged on one sickly boy, and they wondered. Beyond the palace walls, the people lit bonfires for their new queen, but the flames cast long shadows, stretching back to a silent sick room and a crown that had gone to dust. England endured. The Tudors did not. Centuries later, historians would pore over the fragmented records of Edward VI's reign, piecing together the truth from between the lines of courtly lies. The official chronicles spoke of a pious prince, a scholar king taken too soon by divine will, but the private letters, the physician's notes smuggled out of the palace, told another story, one of prolonged agony, of a child tortured by the very men sworn to heal him. In the hushed halls of academia, the reassessment began. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a medical historian, traced the progression of Edward's symptoms through the coded ledgers of Dr. Butts. The mercury treatments alone would have been lethal, she wrote in her groundbreaking study. They poisoned him slowly, masking the tuberculosis until it was too late. The Tudor propaganda machine had done its work too well. Edward's suffering had been sanitized, his death repackaged as a noble sacrifice. Even the portraits lied, showing a rosy-cheeked boy, not the skeletal figure described in Lady Bryan's private correspondence. But the truth, once uncovered, refused to be buried again. A forensic reconstruction of Edward's remains, based on descriptions of his ulcers and the toxins found in his hair samples, revealed the horrifying extent of his decay. The boy who should have been the pinnacle of Tudor glory had been reduced to a vessel of pus and pain, his body collapsing under the weight of misguided treatments and political necessity. They didn't just fail to save him, Dr. Hartwell concluded. They accelerated his demise. Modern eyes, trained to see through the fog of history, recognized the tragedy for what it was. Not just the loss of a king, but the destruction of a child. The medical journals dissected the futility of 16th century remedies, the leeches, the purges, the mercury that corroded Edward's organs, even as it was meant to cure him. And the public, confronted with the unvarnished truth, recoiled. The Tudors were monsters, declared one popular documentary, juxtaposing Henry's gilded portraits with the grim reality of his son's sick room. But the deeper horror lay in the realization that Edward's fate was not unique. Countless others, unnamed, unremembered, had suffered similarly in an age where medicine was as much superstition as science. Edward's tragedy was simply the one deemed worthy of record, and even then, only in whispers. Historians debated the broader implications. Had Edward lived, would England have avoided the religious turmoil of Mary's reign? Would the Tudor line have endured? The questions were endless, the answers forever out of reach. Yet amid the scholarly discourse, one truth remained unshaken. Edward VI's death was not the peaceful passing of legend. It was a slow, excruciating unraveling, a boy screaming into the void while the court outside his door played at normalcy. In the end, the forgotten suffering was remembered, and Henry VIII's ruthless legacy gained one more footnote of infamy.